2 hours. That is how close Washington came to detonating a 50% tariff on $20 billion of Canadian goods before Donald Trump quietly pulled the trigger back. Not canceled it, not withdrawn it. Paused it on a Truth Social post in the dead of night with less than 120 minutes left on the clock. If you want to understand how a single phone call, a stack of unsigned documents, and a prime minister who refused to blink turned a midnight deadline into a 3-day reprieve, stay with this, because the story behind that pause is more complicated and more revealing than the headline lets on. Let's set the scene properly, because context is everything here. This trade war did not start last week. It started on February 1st, 2025, when Donald Trump signed sweeping tariffs against both Canada and Mexico, citing border security and fentanyl flows as his justification. Ottawa's response was immediate. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, and within 3 weeks, as the fight escalated, that number climbed to $155 billion. For a year and a half, the two countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth have been locked in an economic standoff that neither side wanted to admit was actually a war. Here's what most viewers don't realize. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court of the United States actually struck down several of Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs, the ones imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, in a case that trade lawyers have been watching closely, learning resources versus the administration. That ruling mattered because it forced the White House to hunt for a different legal weapon. And they found one. A weapon so obscure that most trade reporters had to look it up. That weapon is called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Read that date again. 1930. This is a Depression-era statute that allows a sitting president to slap additional duties of up to 50% on goods from any country the administration determines is discriminating against American commerce. According to trade analysts tracking the filing, Section 338 has essentially never been invoked this way in modern American history, which is exactly why trade press has started calling it the administration's nuclear option. It is blunt, it is old, and critically, it does not care whether your goods are compliant with the existing free trade agreement. On July 20th, 2026, Donald Trump signed 3 separate Section 338 proclamations. Not one, 3. Each targeting a different category of Canadian goods tied to disputes that have simmered for years: motor vehicles, alcohol, and dairy. The White House framed this as a direct response to what it called Canada's discriminatory treatment of American dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicle exports. The tariffs were built to take effect 30 days after signing, which put the detonation clock at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th, 2026. And here's the detail that should genuinely alarm anyone watching this closely. This 50% tariff, unlike almost every other tariff action in this 2-year trade war, was designed to apply even to goods that are fully compliant with the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement. For a year and a half, CUSMA compliance had been Canada's shield, roughly 85% of all Canada-U. S-trade had continued to flow tariff-free specifically because it fell under that agreement's protection. Section 338 was engineered to punch straight through that shield. No expiry date attached either. This wasn't a temporary shot across the bow. This was designed to be permanent. So what specifically was in the blast radius? According to trade compliance trackers monitoring the proclamation text, the 50% tariff was structured across 3 separate goods lists. The first covered dairy products: milk, cream, whey, and related dairy ingredients. The second, oddly named the motor vehicles list, despite containing no actual cars, covered an enormous sweep of Canadian industry: electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, industrial machinery, cosmetics, fragrances, and even agricultural products like flowers and seeds. The third targeted alcohol directly. In total, according to industry compliance groups tracking the exposure, well over a dozen distinct Canadian industries sat inside the blast zone of a single set of proclamations: cement, hockey sticks, wine, tongue depressors. This wasn't a scalpel, it was a hammer aimed at nearly the entire Canadian export economy that wasn't already covered by earlier rounds of tariffs. Now here's where the story sharpens, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. The CUSMA agreement itself, the very trade pact meant to govern this relationship, had just entered a difficult phase. According to trade law tracking from Blake's, a major Canadian law firm monitoring the tariff timeline, CUSMA's Free Trade Commission had just completed its first mandatory 6-year joint review, required under Article 34 of the agreement. That review's July 1st, 2026 extension deadline passed without an agreement between the two countries. In other words, right as the foundational trade pact between Canada, the United States, and Mexico was up for a legally mandated checkpoint, And right as that checkpoint failed to produce resolution, Washington pulled out its Depression-era hammer. The timing was not a coincidence. It was leverage. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, this put Ottawa in an almost impossible negotiating position. According to analysis from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, fellow Christopher Gunderman explained the bind clearly. From Carney's perspective, Ottawa desperately needs CUSMA renegotiated to get long-term certainty for Canadian businesses. But, as Gunderman put it, you cannot renegotiate a trade agreement in good faith while a massive trade war is actively burning in the background. Every round of tariffs made the eventual deal harder to reach, not easier. By mid-August, with the clock ticking toward the August 19th detonation, the diplomatic machinery in both capitals kicked into overdrive. Canada U.S Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette spent the weekend before the deadline in Washington, D.C., following up on meetings the week prior. On Sunday, LeBlanc met directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. Reporters shouted questions at Greer as he left that meeting. His only comment, delivered with a flash of dry humor, was to wish reporters from Radio Canada a good day in French and otherwise decline to elaborate. LeBlanc, for his part, told reporters afterward, "We're going to continue working," adding pointedly, "Our job is not yet done." That Monday, in St. John's, Newfoundland, Prime Minister Carney addressed reporters at what was ostensibly an unrelated announcement, a hydroelectric power partnership between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. But trade was the only thing anyone wanted to ask him about. Speaking in French, Carney described the negotiations with a phrase that would be repeated across nearly every outlet covering this story over the following 2 days. Very intense and delicate. He added that this was not the time to discuss negotiations in public, and that Ottawa had, in his words, plans to cover all eventualities if the 50% tariffs actually went into effect. That same Monday afternoon, according to the Prime Minister's office, Carney and Trump spoke directly by phone. The PMO would not release details of what was said, only confirming the two leaders discussed the ongoing trade negotiations. It was the first of 2 calls between the two leaders in as many days, an unusually rapid pace of direct leader-to-leader contact for a bilateral trade dispute at this stage. Behind closed doors, according to multiple sources briefed on the talks and cited by the Globe and Mail, the two sides remained genuinely far apart earlier that Monday. But after the LeBlanc meeting with Lutnick and Greer, one source briefed on the negotiations described the odds of reaching a deal as roughly 50-50. On the specific issue of automobiles, arguably the single most economically significant sticking point given how deeply integrated the two countries' auto manufacturing supply chains have become, 3 separate sources told the Globe and Mail that the American offer on the table involved lowering the existing tariff from 25% down to 15%, while maintaining an exemption tied to the value of American content built into Canadian manufactured vehicles. There was also an intriguing subplot playing out around U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's personal role in the talks. One source with knowledge of the negotiations told the Globe and Mail that Lutnick's job was specifically to reinforce the American position, not to search for compromise or meet Canada halfway. But a different source offered a more optimistic reading, suggesting that Lutnick's direct presence at the table could actually be a positive signal for Ottawa, because it indicated that Trump's full circle of economic advisors were unified behind whatever final deal emerged, reducing the risk of the agreement being undercut internally after the fact. As Tuesday, August 18th wore on and the midnight deadline crept closer, the tone in Ottawa shifted from cautious optimism to visible anxiety. According to CTV News political analysis aired that day, Carney had, for the first time, spoken openly about the need to, in his words, prepare for all eventualities. According to CTV analyst Scott Reed, that phrase was widely understood in Ottawa as code for something specific, that Carney was actively contemplating a full new schedule of Canadian counter-tariffs, ready to be deployed the moment the American 50% tariff took effect. Reed was blunt about what that would mean, describing any such move as pure escalation, not de-escalation, in an already exhausted trade relationship. Political pressure was mounting on Carney from an unexpected direction too, not just from economic stakeholders, but from across the aisle. Shuvaloy Majumdar, the Conservative Party's critic for Canada, U.S relations, released a statement that Monday morning, striking a notably bipartisan tone. He said Ottawa's political class was united across party lines on the need to secure a genuine trade deal with what he called an often unpredictable administration in Washington. "Now, we have grown tired of seeing our country used as a punching bag," Majumdar's statement read, adding that there was a shared hope Carney would deliver what he called a genuine win at the negotiating table. When even opposition critics are urging unity rather than division heading into a deadline like this, it tells you something about how seriously Ottawa was treating the stakes. Tuesday afternoon brought the second Carney-Trump phone call in as many days, this one occurring just hours before the midnight tariff deadline. According to the Prime Minister's office, the leaders, quote, spoke again this afternoon about the ongoing negotiations. No further details were released about the substance of that second call. What we do know is what happened next, and it happened fast. Less than 2 hours before the 50% tariffs were scheduled to take effect, Donald Trump posted to Truth Social. According to CTV News and confirmed by Bloomberg's Supply Lines trade desk, Trump announced he was suspending the new tariffs for 3 days, explicitly citing what he called a pending trade deal between Canada and the United States. This was not a full withdrawal. It was not a resolution. It was a pause, granted with the tariff clock quite literally ticking down towards zero. Prime Minister Carney's own statement, released through his office, struck a notably careful and measured tone, deliberately avoiding any language that could be spun as a victory lap. Substantial progress has been made, Carney's statement read, although there's important work still to be done. He confirmed that the United States had agreed to postpone implementation of the 50% tariff under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 until end of day Friday, August 21st. That is the deadline this story is now racing toward. Bloomberg's trade reporting described this moment plainly. The Trump administration delayed the 50% tariffs for 3 days after the two sides reached what Bloomberg characterized as a tentative agreement to resolve a broader trade dispute, one that had, in Bloomberg's words, plunged relations between the two countries to a fresh low. The Washington Post's David Lynch, reporting just days before the pause, had described the two governments as inching closer to a deal, citing industry executives and trade specialists who were tracking the talks closely from the sidelines. It's worth pausing here, quite deliberately, to be completely honest about what actually happened, because the framing of this story matters enormously, and it is very easy to overstate it. Canada did not unilaterally force Trump back to any table through some dramatic single action. What actually happened is more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting. Sustained, grinding, weeks-long diplomatic pressure from Ottawa, combined with the looming threat of Canadian counter-tariffs, combined with visible unity across Canada's political spectrum, combined with genuine economic exposure on the American side, all converged at once to make the cost of following through on the 50% tariff look worse to Washington than the cost of pausing it. Trump did not cancel his own threat. He suspended it at the 11th hour, while publicly insisting a deal was close. Whether that deal actually materializes by the new deadline remains, as of this recording, genuinely unresolved. There's also a sharper, more skeptical read on the timing itself, and it deserves airtime. Political analyst Jeffrey Bloodworth of Gannon University told CTV News Channel that Trump was deliberately dragging the negotiations to the absolute wire in order to achieve what Bloodworth called maximum exposure, essentially using the drama of the deadline itself as a pressure tool and a media spectacle. But Bloodworth added a striking qualifier. He described Trump as playing a game of poker with what Bloodworth bluntly called a terrible hand. That's a notable assessment from an American political analyst, suggesting that despite the aggressive posture and the nuclear option legal tool, the underlying American negotiating position going into this fight was weaker than the 50% number might suggest. Why would that be the case? Look at the numbers. Nearly 330,000 people and roughly $2 billion worth of goods cross the U.S. Canada border every single day, along a 5,525-mile stretch that remains, remarkably, entirely undefended. 800,000 Canadians currently live in the United States. Canadian soldiers fought and died alongside American troops in Afghanistan after September 11th. This is, according to virtually every serious historian and economist tracking the relationship, one of the deepest, most integrated bilateral economic relationships anywhere on the planet. A relationship like that does not unwind cleanly, and both governments know it. It is genuinely difficult to inflict 50% tariff pain on a trading partner, this deeply intertwined with your own economy, without absorbing significant pain domestically in return, whether that's through higher consumer prices, disrupted manufacturing supply chains, or retaliation that lands on politically sensitive American industries. That underlying vulnerability is precisely why Ottawa's leverage, even without a single dramatic headline move, has been real leverage the entire time. Every previous round of Canadian retaliatory tariffs demonstrated that Ottawa was both willing and able to hit back proportionally. That escalating $155 billion retaliation figure from early in this trade war was not forgotten in Washington trade circles. It sat in the background of every single negotiation session since, a quiet reminder that Canada was not simply going to absorb whatever tariff Washington decided to impose. There is another layer to this story that has received less attention, but matters enormously to how average Canadians have experienced this entire 2-year conflict: the grassroots economic response inside Canada itself. According to tracking of what's become known as the Canadian boycott of the United States, which began back in February 2025 alongside the original tariffs, Canadians have organized what analysts describe as a sustained informal boycott of American goods and travel, driven partly by the tariffs themselves and partly by anger over separate rhetoric from the Trump administration about Canadian sovereignty. Trips to the United States by Canadian travelers dropped noticeably. Cross-border shopping patterns shifted. At the provincial level, Ontario's Liquor Control Authority pulled American alcohol from its shelves entirely and cancelled its catalog ordering relationship for restaurants and retailers. Ontario's government also cancelled a $100 million contract it had signed with Elon Musk's Starlink, a move widely read as symbolic retaliation tied to the broader diplomatic chill. None of this shows up directly in Section 338 filings, but all of it shaped the political environment Carney was negotiating inside, because a Canadian government seen as caving too easily to Washington's demands would have faced real domestic backlash, a point multiple Canadian trade analysts have made explicitly on the record. So where does that leave things right now, with the new deadline landing at the end of today, Friday, August 24th? As of this recording, nothing has actually taken effect. The 50% Section 338 tariff remains paused, not canceled, and the outcome genuinely hangs on whether negotiators in Washington and Ottawa can close the remaining gaps before the clock runs out again. Trade compliance trackers monitoring the situation in real time describe 3 realistic paths forward from here. The pause could solidify into a full negotiated deal covering the disputed categories. The deadline could simply be extended again for further talks, similar to what happened between August 18th and August 19th. Or the pause could expire outright, triggering the full 50% tariff across dairy, alcohol, and that sprawling motor vehicles goods list. Nobody outside the negotiating room, and frankly, probably very few people inside it, currently knows for certain which of those 3 outcomes we're heading toward. What we can say with confidence, because it's been stated directly and on the record, is what's actually on the table if a deal does emerge. On automobiles, the clearest reported detail is a reduction from the existing 25% tariff down to 15%, paired with continued exemptions tied to American-made content inside Canadian-assembled vehicles. That would represent a real, tangible reduction in tariff pressure on one of the 2 countries' most deeply integrated industrial sectors, an industry where car parts routinely cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly process before that vehicle is even finished. But dairy, alcohol, and that enormous motor vehicles goods list covering everything from lumber to luggage remain, as of this recording, unresolved question marks. Nothing specific about how those 3 categories get untangled has been confirmed publicly by either government. The auto sector deserves a closer look here, because it's the one piece of this story where real dollar figures and real jobs are attached to every percentage point negotiators argue over. Canada's automotive industry is heavily concentrated in Ontario, and according to the Globe and Mail's reporting on the sector, that industry had already been struggling for years with high costs and a steady shift toward lower-cost manufacturing locations in Mexico and the southern United States, well before this latest round of tariffs hit. Trump's 2025 tariffs, according to that same reporting, hastened a decline that was already underway. In response, Canada built its own tariff remission program, applying 25% tariffs on the non-Canadian or non-Mexican content of imported vehicles, unless the manufacturer maintains an actual production footprint inside Canada. That system, according to the Globe and Mail, has frustrated both Detroit and Washington in roughly equal measure, because it doesn't fit neatly into either side's preferred narrative about who's protecting whom. The numbers behind that frustration are stark. According to industry analysis cited by the Globe and Mail, at the tariff rates under discussion, the effective cost on Canadian-made vehicles works out to somewhere around 7 to 8% of value, which one consultant noted is roughly equivalent to the entire labor cost of building a car in the first place. Stephen Beattie, a consultant and former Toyota Canada executive, put it plainly: Canadian assembly plants might be able to survive low single-digit tariff rates, but once tariffs climb into the high single digits or low double digits, producing cars in Canada simply stops being profitable, and foreign headquartered automakers start actively reassessing whether they even want a Canadian manufacturing footprint at all. This is not abstract policy talk. It is the exact math that determines whether an assembly plant in Ontario stays open for another decade or gets quietly wound down. And the rhetoric coming out of Washington hasn't exactly reassured Ontario's auto workers either. At a Toronto conference, reported on by Automotive Manufacturing Solutions, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was quoted delivering a line that landed hard across the Canadian industry: that the Trump administration, in Lutnick's own words, does not want automotive manufacturing in Canada at all. Coming from the same Commerce Secretary who sat across the table from Dominic LeBlanc during this month's 11th hour negotiations, that comment adds real weight to the skepticism many Canadian industry figures still carry into this deal, even with the 15% auto tariff offer reportedly on the table. As one auto executive told B&M Bloomberg while describing his company's long-term pivot away from reliance on the American market, the world is learning that Trump is a bully, and you don't get anywhere by caving into one. The broader economic damage from this two-year fight is also worth putting in real numbers, not just tariff percentages. According to analysis published by the Michigan Journal of Economics, drawing on Statistics Canada's own reporting, Canada's overall GDP growth slowed to just 1.7%, the weakest performance since the COVID-induced recession of 2020, with the Canadian economy actually contracting by 0.6% in the final quarter of 2025 alone. Statistics Canada was direct about the cause, stating plainly that lower exports, particularly to the United States, were the main contributor to that slowdown. Separate economic modeling cited by capital markets, analysts projected Canada's growth easing to under 1% annually, well below the roughly 2% pace that had been forecast before this trade war began, with the Bank of Canada's own models pointing to sharply contracting exports and business investment as the primary drag. Ontario and Quebec, the two provinces most exposed to steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs, were flagged as bearing a disproportionate share of that pain. It's worth noting, in fairness to Ottawa, that the damage could have been considerably worse. According to that same Michigan Journal of Economics analysis, the CUSMA exemption negotiated during Trump's first term, the same exemption, Section 338, was specifically designed to bypass, had kept over 85% of Canada-U.S. trade tariff-free for most of this conflict, meaningfully limiting the overall economic shock compared to what a truly unrestricted trade war might have inflicted. Carney's government has also been actively working to reduce Canada's economic dependence on the American market altogether, striking a new trade agreement with Indonesia that eliminated tariffs on over 95% of Canadian exports to that country, expanding a trade working group with the United Kingdom focused on digital trade and critical minerals, and deepening trade ties with China, including an expanded quota arrangement announced earlier this year. None of that replaces the American market in the short term. Canada's economy remains deeply, structurally tied to its southern neighbor. But it does suggest Ottawa has been playing a longer game here than any single tariff deadline, quietly building alternatives even while fighting this specific fight to a standstill. It's also worth being transparent about what remains genuinely contested or simply unverified in this story, because a channel like this only works if you can trust what's being said on it. The precise internal substance of both Carney-Trump phone calls has never been released by either government, and both sides have been notably tight-lipped about specifics, which means any claims about exactly what concessions were personally discussed leader to leader remain speculative rather than confirmed. The 50-50 odds of a deal cited by one Globe and Mail source reflect that individual sources' assessment at one specific moment in a fast-moving situation, not an official probability from either government. And whether the Trump administration's broader stated rationale, the claim that Canada has engaged in discriminatory treatment of American dairy, alcohol, and motor vehicle exports, holds up under independent economic scrutiny, remains a genuinely disputed question among trade economists, with plenty of analysts on both sides of that specific argument. Let's also address the dairy dispute directly, because Washington has leaned on it heavily as justification for the entire Section 338 action, and it has a longer history than most viewers realize. American access to Canada's dairy market has been a sore point stretching back well before this administration, rooted in Canada's supply management system, a decades-old policy framework that uses production quotas and tariff rate quotas to control domestic dairy pricing and protect Canadian dairy farmers from being undercut by cheaper American imports. Washington has argued for years, across multiple administrations, that Canada's system violates the spirit, if not always the letter of prior trade agreements, by capping how much American dairy can actually enter the Canadian market before punishing tariffs kick in. Ottawa's position, defended consistently by successive Canadian governments, including Carney's, is that supply management is a legitimate domestic agricultural policy, not a trade violation, and that dismantling it would devastate thousands of Canadian dairy farming families for the benefit of a relatively small slice of American agricultural exports. That fundamental disagreement predates Section 338 by years, and it is exactly the kind of entrenched structural dispute that a 3-day tariff pause is not going to resolve on its own, no matter what gets announced by end of day today. Softwood lumber tells a similar story, and it's the other issue explicitly named by American officials as central to their discriminatory treatment argument. The softwood lumber dispute between the two countries stretches back decades, through multiple prior trade agreements and World Trade Organization rulings, most of which have historically favored Canada's position that its provincial stumpage fee system does not constitute an unfair subsidy the way American lumber producers have long claimed. That history matters here because it shows this isn't a fight Trump invented. It's a fight he inherited, repackaged under an obscure 1930 statute, and escalated to a scale no prior administration attempted. Understanding that lineage is part of understanding why Ottawa has been so unwilling to simply cave to the current pressure campaign. Canadian negotiators have watched versions of this exact argument play out, and largely hold up under international scrutiny multiple times before. Zoom out for a moment, because there's a bigger structural story sitting underneath all of this day-to-day drama out of Washington and Ottawa. This entire fight is unfolding while CUSMA itself, the actual foundational trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, sits in the middle of a mandated renegotiation process following that stalled 6-year review. Every tariff threat, every Section 1338 proclamation, every phone call between Carney and Trump is happening in the shadow of that larger, slower-moving negotiation over what North American trade actually looks like for the next 6 years. Christopher Gunderman's point from earlier in this story cuts right to the heart of it. You cannot meaningfully renegotiate a trade agreement while a live trade war is burning in the background. Which means even if today's deadline resolves peacefully, even if a deal on autos, dairy, and alcohol gets finalized by end of day, that almost certainly is not the end of Canada, trade tension. It is, at best, one contained fire being put out, while the larger structural negotiation over CUSMA's future continues to smolder underneath everything else. Before we close, here's a fair accounting of where this reporting comes from, because you deserve to know exactly what's confirmed and what's still developing. The core tariff timeline, the Section 338 proclamations, the goods lists, and the pause itself are drawn from trade compliance tracking and directly from Prime Minister Carney's own official statement released through the Prime Minister of Canada's office. The day-by-day negotiation details, the phone calls, the Washington meetings, LeBlanc's comments, Carney's remarks, and St. John's all come from live reporting by CTV News, BNN Bloomberg, and CP24, cross-checked against Bloomberg's Supply Lines trade desk and the Washington Post's coverage from David Lynch. The Section 338 legal background and the Supreme Court ruling come from trade law tracking published by Blake's. Background on the broader 2-year trade war and the Canadian boycott movement draws on established timeline documentation. The auto sector reporting, including Stephen Beatty's and Howard Litnick's comments, comes from the Globe and Mail and Automotive Manufacturing Solutions. The GDP and broader economic impact figures are drawn from Statistics Canada. Reporting is cited by the Michigan Journal of Economics, alongside Bank of Canada modeling referenced in independent capital markets analysis. Every specific figure you heard in this script, the $20 billion tariff exposure, the 15% auto tariff offer, the 50-50 deal odds, the $155 billion retaliation figure, traces back to one of those named sources. What remains genuinely unverified, as laid out a moment ago, is the private substance of the leader-to-leader calls and the ultimate outcome of today's deadline itself. Because, as of this recording, that outcome simply has not happened yet. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this actually plays out, and not just the headline version of it. This channel exists specifically to track stories like this one past the point where most outlets stop paying attention, past the initial deadline drama, into whatever actually gets signed or doesn't in the days that follow. If today's deadline produces a real deal, or produces another extension, or produces nothing at all and the tariffs actually land, that update deserves the same level of scrutiny this story just got, and it will get exactly that here. If you want to be there when the next chapter of this drops, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it. There's a broader pattern we're sitting with too, one that extends well past this single tariff deadline. Watching how Ottawa has navigated an administration that even conservative critics inside Canada describe as unpredictable tells you something about how mid-sized economies are increasingly forced to operate in a world where a single truth social post at 11 o'clock at night can move billions of dollars in trade exposure overnight. That is not a uniquely Canadian problem. It is becoming the operating environment for nearly every country that trades heavily with the United States. Understanding how Carney's government threaded this particular needle, sustained pressure, visible domestic unity, credible retaliation held in reserve rather than deployed prematurely, offers a genuine case study in how smaller economies can push back against that kind of unpredictability without triggering full economic rupture. If that broader pattern interests you as much as this specific standoff does, this channel is going to keep digging into exactly those dynamics as they unfold elsewhere too. And subscribing means you'll see that analysis the moment it's ready, not weeks later after the story's already cooled. One more thing worth flagging honestly before we go. Stories like this one rarely resolve as cleanly as either government would like the public to believe. Trade deals of this complexity, spanning autos, dairy, and alcohol simultaneously, tend to produce partial agreements, side letters, and follow-up disputes, rather than one tidy signing ceremony. Even if today's deadline passes without the 50% tariff taking effect, don't be surprised if pieces of this exact same fight resurface in a few months under a slightly different name. That is precisely the kind of follow-through most news coverage doesn't bother providing once the initial deadline drama fades from the front page. This channel will. Turning on notifications, or simply subscribing now, is how you make sure that follow-up actually reaches you when it happens, rather than getting buried later. So here's the honest, open question this whole situation leaves us with, and I'm genuinely curious where you land on it. Is what happened this week a real structural turning point? Evidence that sustained pressure and quiet unity can actually make an unpredictable administration blink and negotiate seriously? Or is this simply the same brinkmanship cycle this relationship has been stuck in for a year and a half now? Another temporary pause before the next deadline, the next threat, and the next 11th hour phone call between two leaders who both know how much is genuinely at stake for both countries if this relationship actually breaks. Drop your take in the comments. I read them, and I'm genuinely interested in how differently people are reading this depending on which side of the border they're watching from. Thanks for spending this time with the story. Until the next one.